Imagine a gathering that reshaped the faith of billions. What many believe to have been a spiritually inspired encounter was, in reality, a meticulously calculated political maneuver. The Council of Nicaea, held in 325 CE, is remembered as the moment Christianity defined its unity. But behind the prayers and solemn speeches stood Emperor Constantine, a man who saw religion not merely as a matter of faith, but as the perfect tool to consolidate his power and keep a fragmented Roman Empire under control. At that time, the Roman Empire stretched from Europe to the Middle East and North Africa. It was torn by civil wars, economic crises, and bloody rivalries. Constantine had recently secured his position after defeating other emperors, but he knew it wasn't enough to win battles. He needed to stabilize his authority. He found in religion the key to unify peoples who, though divided, were beginning to coalesce around Christianity. However, Christianity wasn't uniform. There were numerous interpretations of who Jesus was, what his nature was, and how his teachings should be followed. This diversity, which might seem like spiritual richness, was a threat to a ruler. How could an empire sustain itself if even its fastest-growing religion was in pieces? It was then that Constantine realized he needed to act swiftly to transform religious chaos into political consensus. The greatest conflict of the era involved two irreconcilable visions. On one side, Arius, a presbyter from Alexandria, argued that Jesus was a being created by God, elevated above men but not equal to the Father. On the other, his opponents, led by Athanasius, insisted that Christ was eternal, divine, and of the same substance as the Father. This dispute ignited entire communities, divided bishops, and even caused riots in the streets. For Constantine, it was clear, if there were no answer, faith could become fuel for new civil wars. Thus was born the Council of Nicaea, a gathering presented as a sacred debate, but which in truth was the stage for a skillful emperor who used faith as cement to keep his empire standing. What would be decided there would not only change the history of religion, but would define the course of Western civilization. And it is precisely there that a detail almost never told is hidden, something that reveals the true nature of this council. When the bishops arrived in Nicaea, they found a scene that more resembled an imperial court than a religious assembly. Housed at state expense, received at lavish banquets, and closely watched by the emperor, they knew they were not in a free debate. Every word spoken there carried political weight. Every decision could mean exile or prestige. Constantine presided like a judge, imposing limits and making it clear that he would not tolerate endless discussions. At the heart of the debate was the question, was Jesus a creature elevated by God, or was he God himself, equal to the Father in essence? For us today, it might sound like a distant, almost academic question, but in that century, this discussion could ignite entire cities. After all, it wasn't just philosophy. It was the very identity of faith at stake, and with it, the stability of an empire. The resolution seemed inevitable. Arius and his doctrine were condemned, and the council declared that Jesus was of the same substance as the Father. This simple, clear, and seemingly definitive formula would be the foundation of Christian orthodoxy. But make no mistake, this decision was not born of spiritual consensus, but of political pressures. It was the necessity of giving the Roman Empire a unique doctrine that everyone could repeat as a sign of unity. And that is how one of the most influential documents in history, the Nicene Creed, emerged. By signing it, each bishop not only expressed a conviction of faith, but also swore loyalty to the emperor. To question the creed didn't just mean disagreeing with a religious doctrine, but challenging the established political order. Heresy ceased to be merely theological error. It became a crime against the state. Now I want to hear from you. Write the phrase, "Faith was shaped by power." I want to see how many of you are realizing how religion, already in the 4th century, ceased to be merely spirituality and transformed into pure politics. What is striking about the Council of Nicaea is not only what was decided, but how it was decided. The imposition of a standardized creed did not reflect the plurality of early Christianity. Before this meeting, there were communities that saw Jesus as an enlightened human prophet. Others interpreted him as a mystical teacher, and some understood him as a divine figure who only appeared human. This diversity was vibrant, but under the emperor's gaze, it was flattened into a rigid formula that excluded any other interpretation. This exclusion was brutal. Texts that did not align with the new orthodoxy were marginalized, silenced, or destroyed. Teachers and leaders who did not submit to the creed were persecuted, condemned to exile, or simply erased from history. Christianity, which once breathed diversity, began to breathe control. What was multiplicity became uniformity. What was debate became dogma. And it is important to note, the majority of the faithful did not participate in these decisions. For the peasant, the soldier, or the artisan of the time, concerned with hunger, disease, and heavy taxes, it mattered little whether Jesus was of the same substance as the Father. Father or not, the council didn't reflect daily concerns. It reflected the concerns of emperors and bishops who saw faith as a field of power. The result was that from Nicaea onwards, questioning orthodoxy wasn't just a spiritual risk, but a political threat. The heretic ceased to be merely someone with a different view and became an enemy of the Roman Empire. And here arises the big question: if eternal truth was defined in a political hall under the gaze of an emperor who wasn't even profoundly Christian, to what extent can this truth be considered of divine origin? Divine origin. Constantine himself is living proof of the contradiction surrounding the council. Although he convened and led the meeting, his relationship with Christianity was always pragmatic. He continued to celebrate pagan rituals, maintained the title of high priest of the Roman religion, and had coins minted with the god Sol Invictus. Even his baptism only occurred on his deathbed, and ironically, at the hands of a bishop sympathetic to the very view that Nicaea had condemned. This detail reveals something essential. The emperor wasn't interested in which interpretation of Christ was truer. What he wanted was consensus, because consensus meant unity, and unity meant political survival. Theology for Constantine was merely a cog in the great machinery of government. The bishops present were not neutral either. Many saw the council as an opportunity to gain prestige, financial support, and proximity to imperial power. Supporting the correct formula meant more than professing faith. It was a passport to influence and stability. Those who resisted, however, were punished with exile, and their works were burned in an attempt to erase them, not just from the empire, but from memory. What arose after Nicaea was not just a creed, but an institution. Christianity ceased to be a movement of diverse communities and became a centralized organism, administered from the top down. Faith, once rooted in popular experience, transformed into a system controlled by the throne and the altar. And here is a question for you to ponder. If the line separating religion from politics was erased as early as 325, does what we call pure faith still bear the marks of this agreement between bishops and emperors today? The Council of Nicaea also made it clear how language can be used as a weapon. Complex philosophical terms like substance and essence were imported from the Greek vocabulary to shape the creed. Words that were never on the lips of Jesus or his first followers became central to the definition of faith. Thus, popular Christianity, made of simple parables and communal practices, was converted into abstract debates that only the most literate could comprehend. This change was not innocent. It gave more power to the bishops and theologians who became the only ones capable of interpreting the new official language. The common people, once active participants in narratives and traditions, became dependent on authorities to understand what they should believe. The result was the concentration of religious power in the hands of a few, and like all concentrated power, it quickly mingled with violence. Arius and his followers had their writings burned, their voices silenced, and their reputations stained. It was as if the council said, "What doesn't fit doesn't exist." This attitude marked the beginning of a new era in which faith ceased to be resistance against oppression and became an instrument of it. This transformation also meant that theological divergences began to be treated as crimes. The same Rome that once persecuted Christians now used Christianity to persecute Christians who thought differently. The movement that had been born among the persecuted itself began to erect the apparatus of persecution. And here is a point that opens a new enigma. How could a religion that preached humility and compassion transform so quickly into a system that legitimized exile, censorship, and even the destruction of ideas? The political consequences of Nicaea were immediate. From that moment, religion and state walked side by side across the Roman Empire, including Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. Loyalty to the creed came to mean loyalty to the emperor. Questioning the official definitions was seen as a threat, not only to the church, but to the empire itself. Faith became a tool of social vigilance, where believing correctly equated to being a good citizen. This process also opened space for Christianity to stop emphasizing ethical practice in favor of doctrinal correctness. Before, communities valued charity, humility, and care for the poor. After Nicaea, what defined who was in or out was no longer behavior, but the ability to repeat the correct formula about the divinity of Jesus. This had profound effects. A cruel but orthodox man could be celebrated, while someone kind but divergent could be condemned. Faith, in this sense, ceased to be a way of life and became a test of loyalty. A recited creed mattered more than a just life. The curious thing is that this model facilitated the work of the empire. Ethics could be subversive, questioning injustice, resisting abuse, defending the marginalized. A fixed creed, however, was easy to monitor. It was enough to ask, "Do you believe or do you not believe?" Also brought religion to heel, and I want to hear from you. Comment on the phrase, "A creed is not faith," down below. I want to see who realizes that since Nicaea, belief stopped being merely spirituality and became political obedience. A detail often ignored is that the Council of Nicaea didn't actually resolve the conflicts. On the contrary, it inaugurated decades of even fiercer disputes. Arius was condemned, exiled, and had his texts destroyed. But soon after he was called back, rehabilitated, and condemned again. Even Constantine himself, according to some sources, received baptism from a bishop sympathetic to Arian ideas on his deathbed. This shows how unstable the supposed definitive truth of the council actually was. This instability exposes the political nature of the meeting. If the decision had been divine revelation, it would have ended the matter. But as it was a product of human negotiations, it continued to be questioned, revised, and even rejected by later emperors across the Roman Empire. In practice, Nicaea didn't provide a definitive theological answer. It merely established the precedent that the emperor had authority to decide on religious matters. From then on, new councils were convened. Constantinople, Ephesus, and Chalcedon repeated the same model. Gather bishops, discuss doctrines, and approve decrees under the watchful eye of imperial power. Each time, the idea was presented to the people that eternal truth was being revealed there. But behind the scenes, what really happened were factional disputes, political alliances, and decisions shaped by the need to maintain the unity of the Roman Empire, from Europe to the Middle East and North Africa. The effect of this was devastating for religious diversity. Entire generations of texts, traditions, and interpretations disappeared because they didn't correspond to the official orthodoxy. The faith that once flourished in multiple forms was reduced to a single mold. The price of uniformity was the irreversible loss of cultural and spiritual richness. And an uncomfortable question remains. If another faction had won, or if another emperor had supported a different side, would today's Christian faith not be completely distinct? Another crucial point of the council was the officialization of the category of heresy. Before, divergences existed, but there was no central tribunal that defined who was right or wrong. After Nicaea, orthodoxy and heresy became political labels. Those who aligned with the Nicene Creed were protected by the empire. Those who disagreed were treated as enemies of order. It was the first time that spiritual disagreement transformed into a political crime. This innovation had direct consequences for the following centuries. Inquisitions, persecutions, and even religious wars find their roots in this moment. By decreeing that truth could be defined and imposed by the state, the council paved the way for questioning faith to be equated with treason. The heretic was seen not only as a sinner, but as a threat to social stability. And it wasn't just doctrine that was standardized. Even the date of Easter was unified at the council. It may seem like a minor detail, but it reveals the logic of the meeting. If faith was to be an instrument of unity, then even the religious calendar needed to be under control. Nothing could be left to chance, as every difference represented a risk of division. In the long term, this fusion between faith and power profoundly altered Christian spirituality. The focus shifted from the ethical message of Jesus, his parables and teachings of compassion, to concentrating on dogmatic formulas that could be used as a test of loyalty. Faith became a political oath recited before the community. And here's a reflection for you. To what extent is what we call religion, in fact, merely a memory filtered by centuries of decrees, repressions, and imperial strategies? If we observe the legacy of Nicaea, it becomes clear that Christianity would never be the same. What was once a diverse and decentralized community movement transformed into a hierarchical institution organized from top to bottom. The local bishop in Alexandria, who was once merely a figure of reference in his city, became an authority connected to a larger system, dependent on the empire and its decrees. Christianity ceased to be resistance to power and became an arm of it. This process created a new type of religious leadership. Bishops who aligned with Constantine were rewarded with prestige, wealth, and political influence. Those who opposed were pushed to the margins, treated as dangerous, and in many cases, erased from history. The Nicene Creed became a watershed, not only separating doctrines, but defining who had access to power and who would be excluded from it. From then on, truth ceased to be sought in prayer or in community debate. It became something decreed in councils, stamped by emperors, and imposed as law. This fusion between faith and politics created a formula that would be repeated throughout history. Solemn meetings, standardized texts, threats of exile, and the construction of an official memory that erased everything that wasn't convenient. For common faithful, little changed in their immediate lives. They continued to face hunger, heavy taxes, and diseases, but now, in addition, they were called upon to recite formulas of faith that perhaps they didn't fully comprehend. Religion distanced itself from practical life and became increasingly a matter of institutional obedience. And this is perhaps the greatest legacy of Nicaea. It shows that religious truth can be shaped not by spiritual pursuit, but by the need to maintain power and unity. Faith was shaped by power, of an empire. The Council of Nicaea in 325 also established a pattern of selective memory. Later accounts were rewritten to portray the gathering as a triumph of faith guided by the Holy Spirit. What was truly a clash rife with rivalries, intrigues, and imperial pressures ended up narrated as sacred harmony. The official version, repeated over centuries, erased the chaos to leave only an image of unity. However, records closer to the actual events reveal something quite different: heated disputes, shouting, even physical aggressions among bishops. It is said that Nicholas of Myra, later an inspiration for Santa Claus, even struck Arius during the debate. Whether fact or legend, the detail shows that the atmosphere was far from the serene image conveyed by later tradition. This process of rewriting collective memory allowed generations to believe that orthodoxy was born fully formed as divine revelation. But the truth is, it was forged in the heat of politics within a Roman Empire in crisis that desperately needed cohesion. The belief billions repeat today did not descend from the heavens, but emerged from a hall filled with human interests. The most intriguing thought is to consider if fundamental doctrines were shaped by political circumstances. To what extent are what we call eternal truths, not in reality, echoes of decisions made in times of fragility and power? This uncomfortable reflection compels us to view religion not merely as spirituality, but as history. If you've made it this far, I have a special favor to ask. Please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and activate the notification bell. This way, you won't miss any upcoming content, and you'll help spread this critical perspective on how history shaped what many call faith. Faith was shaped by power. Faith was